Welcome to End of Life University on YouTube. Today I'm sharing with you an interview I did with Joe Primo about how to talk with children about death and grief. It's a really valuable conversation. It's from the archives. I recorded it a few years ago, but I thought it was so important I wanted to bring it out now. So, disclaimer, there may be some differences in audio quality compared to the episodes you hear now. Also, it's audio only, and it's possible that some of the links that we mention in the interview are no longer active. So I just wanted to prepare you for that, but still the content is really valuable. So I think you'll enjoy it. Don't forget to subscribe to this channel down below. Also, subscribe or follow the podcast wherever you happen to listen. Leave a rating and review. And if you're able to, chip in a little bit to help support, keep this channel and the podcast on the air. Go to eoluniversity.com/support. So let's move on with my interview with Joe Primo. Hello, everyone, and welcome to End of Life University podcast, where we share real talk about life and death. And I'm happy that you're joining me here today. I'm your host, as always, Dr. Karen Wyatt, and this is episode number 224. In just a few minutes, I'll be sharing an interview with you about helping children with grief and talking to them about death. But before that, I have a couple of important announcements. So hang in there with me while I let you know just a little bit of information. First of all, if you are interested in purchasing my book, What Really Matters: 7 Lessons for Living from the Stories of the Dying, you need to do that before the end of this year, before the end of 2019. It's going off sale starting in 2020. The reason for that is that I've sold the publishing rights to the book to a publisher from the UK, and they are going to re-release the book under a new title with a new cover, and I've also written a revision of the book for them at their request. So it's in many ways it will be the same book, but there will also be some significant changes to it when it comes out again in May 2020. And as part of my agreement with the publisher, I'm taking the original book off sale at the beginning of the year. So if you're interested in having that original book, you need to purchase it before the end of the year. On Amazon, you can also get the ebook on Kobo, Kobo. You can order an autographed copy from my website. I have a few left, not a lot, but I do have a few, and that would mean I would mail it to you, and you would need to be a little bit patient just because of the holidays and my schedule right now. It may take me a little while to get it to you. It won't be as quick as, say, 2-day shipping on Amazon Prime or so. So I just wanted to let you know about that. What Really Matters, still available as a print book, audio book, or ebook on Amazon, and as an ebook on Kobo, print book from my website. So check it out and see if that's something you'd like to have. And you can go to eoluniversity.com. You can purchase it there. Also, my other website, which is karenwyattmd.com. The book is available on both of those places. And stay tuned because I'll let you know when the new book is available for pre-order, if any of you are hoping instead to get the new version. So I'm excited about that and really happy with the changes we've made to the book. So I'll keep you posted as I get more information about it. And then another new thing to announce to you is that I have started a new bonus for Patreon supporters, which is posting movie reviews as I have promised in the past. So my husband and I have now reviewed our first movie, which is titled You're Not You, is the name of the movie we reviewed. And I'm calling our little series of reviews 2 Doctors and a Movie. We had so much fun recording it, and so we're excited to keep watching movies that deal with death, dying, grief issues, and putting out our thoughts and ideas about these movies and which ones we think are worth watching and why. So in order to hear those reviews, you have to be a Patreon supporter, and you can sign up for that for as little as $2 a month at patreon.com/EOLU. And I'd like to thank my latest supporters on Patreon. I'm so grateful. This week, I had a bumper crop of supporters who joined us. So I'd like to thank Cheryl Schimek, Linda Reed, Elizabeth Cascada Rogalski, Hillary Walker, and Joanna Brown. Thank you so much for signing up on my Patreon page and joining us as a team, and I hope you enjoy the movie review. And then remember, I'm also recording monthly end of life news updates. So there will be a new update coming out in the next few weeks for kind of the end of December and end of the year updates on news around the end of life. So, with all that being said, we'll move on to the interview. Today, I am sharing with you an interview that I actually recorded a year ago with Joe Primo, who is the CEO of an organization called Good Grief. And that's an advocacy and education organization that supports grieving children. And we have a wonderful conversation about grief in childhood and with lots and lots of tips and resources for how to talk to children about death and dying and how to support grieving children. This was one of my all-time favorite interviews that I did last year, and it was posted in my former interview series but has never been part of the podcast. So I thought I'd share it with you this year. Last week, I had a conversation with Frances Weller about grief, and we really talked about grief from an adult perspective. So I wanted to add on this interview to make sure we addressed childhood grief, and I think everyone will find it interesting. There are so many resources. I hope you'll take advantage of them. You can go to the show notes for this episode at eolupodcast.com, and I have links to all of the resources that Joe and I talk about and all of the websites that we mention in this interview. So be sure and check those out. eolupodcast.com, episode number 224. And as always, stay tuned after this interview, and I'll come back with a few of my own takeaways and to say goodbye. So here we go. I have a very special guest today, Joe Primo, who is the CEO of Good Grief, a not-for-profit organization for children, teens, and families who are grieving. He is a passionate advocate for changing the conversation on grief and bereavement, and is the author of the book, What Do We Tell the Children? Talking to Kids About Death and Dying, among other books as well. Joe is the immediate past president of the National Alliance for Grieving Children and a graduate of Yale University, where he studied ethics and end-of-life counseling. And if you'd like to know more about Good Grief, you can visit the website, which is good-grief.org. So, Joe, thank you so much for joining me today.
Hey, Karen, thanks so much for having me. I'm glad to be here.
Yes, I'm really excited to talk to you because this is a topic that I feel needs much more exposure, even within the end-of-life community and people who are working in the end-of-life. I believe even in 2018 that children are sometimes forgotten about when we talk about grief and when we're dealing with bereavement with families.
Yeah, it is crazy when you think that here we are in 2018 and with all that we know and our access to resources, this is still such a huge knowledge gap for us.
Yes, definitely. And before we get started, why don't you just tell us a little more about your own story and how you became interested in supporting grieving children?
Yeah, sure, of course. So my story is one in which I think it came to fruition in hindsight, well, the path that led me here at least. So when I was 14 years old, I went to visit my grandparents with my kid sister. They had retired on a beautiful lake in Maine called Sebago Lake. And we were halfway through a vacation with them in this, during August before school resumed. And some aunts and uncles came up to visit. And while they were visiting, they just arrived. We made lunch and we sat down for tuna melts and salad. And while we were eating, my aunt dropped dead of a heart attack. And I watched my grandmother and my uncle try to revive her. And while Naples, Maine isn't that rural, it's still a volunteer paramedic squad. And it took a very long time, at least it felt like eternity, for help to arrive. it was such a scary experience for me that I did what I think a lot of parents try to do, and I tried to protect my kid sister. So I locked her in my grandmother's closet. And when I tell this story, I say she's very adverse to polyester and other synthetic fabrics as a result. And, it was one of those moments that just change how you see the world. Somebody was with me one moment. We hugged, we kissed. Hey, it's so good to see you. Sit down, have lunch, and then gone. And then to see the horror in my grandparents and in my aunts and uncles' faces, you don't forget that. And I think that experience planted a seed in me that would later take me to graduate school to study end-of-life ethics and counseling, and then later to become a hospice chaplain. And I was a hospice chaplain at the Connecticut Hospice. And that experience also was one of those moments that just change how you see the world. I was with over 2,000 people when they died, and I was with most of them at their time of death. And the ones that stuck with me were the young parents who were saying goodbye to their kids, and it was my job to facilitate that goodbye and to really begin building a bridge to the children's future. What happened in that moment was so critical to their ultimate outcomes. But I'm not sure I fully realized that. What I knew at that time is that I felt powerless. I didn't know what to say. I didn't know how to be helpful. I didn't know what the kids' needs were. And I didn't really feel like I was meeting those needs. And, one day enough was enough. And I realized I needed to become a part of the change and find the resources to provide support to the kids. And if I couldn't find them, then I was going to produce them myself. And it was at that time that I joined Good Grief, which was an organization that had been around for a couple of years, providing education and some advocacy. It was really a startup. And then I was brought in by the founding board to design the program. And it's been an incredible journey really since. So it's nothing I necessarily sought out to do, but through experience and through that helpless feeling and seeing the kids who were hurting and who deserved and needed more, I found myself on a path that brought me to this place today.
Wow, that's really a beautiful story. And I love hearing kind of the threads in someone's story, how they all eventually come together, these diverse experiences we have in life that, sometimes it's a life-changing experience when we're very young that is going to determine what happens later in our adulthood, which I guess is another reason why we really do need to be paying attention to children who are experiencing grief and helping them with that process so that it becomes something that could be a rich experience later on to look back on in their lives.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm just thinking about that observation, Karen. I am a Mr. Rogers groupie. I like to think that I know things about Fred that he didn't know about himself because I have so sufficiently stalked his life work. But, one thing that Mr. Rogers said to generations of children and ultimately to adults, if adults were listening, is that what happens in childhood affects adulthood. And if life can pluck a mom, a dad, a brother or sister, a grandpa, an aunt, an uncle, a best friend from our lives when we're little kids or even big kids, and there's no support in place, we have to ask ourselves, what's to become of those children if they go unsupported? And certainly some of them will already have built some resilience within themselves based on other adverse experiences that they've had. But many will go it alone and many will suffer tremendously. And when I'm speaking, our volunteers at Good Grief, when I'm talking to other adults now who lost someone significant in their life as a kid and didn't get support, time and time again, people tell me their lives would have gone a very different route. And if not a different route, it would have been more manageable if they had the support in place that they deserved when that death had occurred. So this is, in so many ways, I think this is on all of us to really look at this issue and to build the infrastructure and the support that's necessary for kids. And I think more, and maybe that even starts at asking ourselves what makes us uncomfortable with end-of-life issues, those things that you tackle on this show all the time. What about our mortality makes us uncomfortable? What about other people's pain and suffering make us uncomfortable? What about seeing a child hurting makes us uncomfortable? Because we have to get our own stuff out of the way in order to start really showing up for kids.
So true. And I think that really is one of the big obstacles, is that many of us have not done our own work around grief and end-of-life issues, and therefore can't begin to know how to talk to kids and how to be there. And I wanted to ask you to shed a little more light on, you did a TEDx talk, which is on the Good Grief website, called Grief is Good. And I wanted you to just, as we start out talking about grief, just to remind all of us, grief is good. And would you talk about that a little bit more?
Yeah, thanks, Karen. We're living in a time when grief is starting to become pathologized. In 1969, Kubler-Ross wrote on Death and Dying and said, "Hey, Americans, wake up. You are not talking about this critical issue. We're all going to die. 100% mortality rate here, folks." And still here we are today without a heck of a lot changed. There are more shows, This Is Us, etc., out there that's addressing grief. But when it comes to us being able to talk about grief and it being a human experience, we're not doing such a hot job. And when I think about grief, think about people across the whole entire world. Think about animals. There was this summer a video that went viral. The news was following a whale that was pushing its dead calf around for weeks, and it was grieving. We know that elephants and a lot of other animals grieve. The truth of the matter is, every single person since the beginning of time, no matter your race, no matter your culture, no matter your socioeconomics, every human experiences grief. It's part of the human experience. And so that to me begs, well, let's ask the question, what purpose does it serve? And in the end, grief is a really hard thing, right? It shakes us to our core. It forces us to ask difficult questions about how and why these things happened. It forces us to deal with very difficult and uncomfortable feelings that we may never have experienced before. So it's hard work, and yet it's universal work. And just because it's hard doesn't make it bad. And what I've seen in my work is that when grief is supported in all of its environments and all of its many manifestations, when we take care of people who are grieving, and when we surrender to it, and when we get on the grief roller coaster and let grief do its job, in the end, it helps us adapt to a new world and a new reality as somebody who has lost someone or something that we love. That in the end, it forces us and helps us reshape our identity as a person who is now living this new life without our loved ones. So grief very much serves a purpose, and while it is hard in its process, and while it is something that we carry with us throughout a lifetime, it's something that can become more manageable. It's something that we can integrate into who we are and into our daily lives. And when we do that integration, we actually are better people for it. We're healthier. And what the research shows is that we also become more empathic and caring individuals as a result of these adverse experiences, such as losing a loved one. And of course, none of us would wish that on ourselves, and certainly not on our children. But to know that when these things happen, therein lies an opportunity for for growth, and that happens when the human connection is strong, and when we're present for each other.
So true. That's so beautiful. I sometimes have thought the very thing you were talking about, that we can look at other cultures and other people around the world and find many differences between us, but the thing we share is that we're all mortal, we will all die, and we all grieve, and we all have experienced loss. But those are two very profound connectors that really bring us all together.
Oh, totally. Yep.
And and as far as children and grief, Joe, what are we getting wrong here in our society? I'm sure there are many things, but just from your experience, what are we missing in terms of helping children with grief?
Well, if you look at the sex ed model, there's some parallels there. As a culture, we don't effectively talk about sex, and we don't effectively talk about death. They're everywhere. They're pervasive in violent forms, in misogynistic forms. It's there, but we're not addressing it in a meaningful way. And when we look at kids, I mean, you can think historically, we think if we don't talk about sex, then kids aren't going to do it. If we don't talk about suicide, then kids aren't going to do it. Well, the truth of the matter is, we need to be talking about emotional intelligence. EQ matters. We need to teach children not just about happy, sad, mad, but the complexity of different feelings and emotions. Like, disappointment is a thing. Guilt is a thing. Jubilation is a thing. To be able to name feelings, to be able to express and articulate the things that hurt, that's really important, because if we're not teaching children to have these conversations, we're minimizing their ability to have an empathic response. We're setting them up for unhealthy coping. We are not giving them the tools and the resources that they need in order to navigate their lives, whether it be the adversity of losing somebody important in their life, which one day they will, expectedly or unexpectedly, or any other type of loss. And we're talking today about grief and the manifestation of bereavement, but grief plays out in so many different ways. So why aren't we equipping our kids with the tools and the resources necessary to navigate this stuff? So I think it happens early on, of course, in the household. I think it needs to be happening in schools. I think it needs to happen in other contexts that, some of them may not be applicable to all, but within religious institutions, etc. That this is very, very important stuff. And if we were to address it, I think it would ultimately impact many other issues that we have going on in this country, including substance abuse and obesity. But I feel that we struggle immensely with talking about the hard stuff. I think we have a long history of avoiding the hard stuff. And in the end, the adults make that decision, but the children pay the price for it.
Mm-hmm. Well, I know I've been in many situations where I've heard adults talk about younger children in the family when a death has occurred, and saying things like, well, they'll never remember this. They're too young to remember this. Like, oh, this won't affect my 4-year-old. They'll never remember this someday. And really glossing over the experience of a death for children, especially at younger ages, but I think in general, probably all ages, we tend to miss the severity of the impact on kids. But what would you say about that? What about the impact of grief, say, on a 4-year-old?
Yeah, so I think one of the things we miss is the learning opportunity. when I give a talk or something, I joke about the dead goldfish and, talk before you flush, that there are so many opportunities to prepare kids with, I don't want to diminish it, but an insignificant loss to prepare them for a more significant loss. So the dead goldfish, don't replace the goldfish. No two goldfish ever look alike. We all know that. The roadkill, I'm in New Jersey and we do a number on deer up here. So don't just drive by the deer and pretend that it's not dead. Those are all teaching moments to talk about what it means to be dead. At the end of the day, Karen, I think people operate from a place of care and they want to make sure that kids are okay, right? So these are well-intended decisions. They just aren't well informed oftentimes, or people just don't know better because they themselves weren't given the tools or the language to talk about this hard stuff. And if you're old enough to love, you're old enough to grieve. That's something that's said over and over again in the field of childhood bereavement as we're trying to change the culture. That child who is 2 months old knows the smell of mom. They know her voice. They know what it feels like to be comforted from mom. They will know that stark absence if she dies in a car accident and doesn't come home. That child will grieve and carry it with them. At Good Grief, we serve kids starting at age 3. The only reason for that age is really because we're not babysitters and we don't change diapers. We're not very good at diapers. But that 1-year-old and that 2-year-old very much grieves. And I've heard so many stories of 3-year-olds being written off because they're 3. I've had a 3-year-old say to me, "Don't tell mommy that dad killed himself. She thinks it was a heart attack." Like, kids pick up things from other adults. They are observant. They are sponges. I've witnessed kids afraid to go into the kitchen because they remember the night when dad tore it apart when he got news that mom had died, and dad went ballistic and just let out all of his grief, in a very normal and appropriate fit, and the kids walked in and happened to see it. Is it true that the memories of the person who died start to fade? Yes. But it's also true that the kids are filled with fear and anxiety that they're not going to remember because they want to preserve those memories. So again, it's not on them, it's on us adults. So when we pack up all of people's stuff and we throw it in a box and we give it away and we make the home look like that person never existed, when we stop sharing memories and we stop bringing that person's name into conversations because it's too painful, when we normalize the silence and the erasure, well, those things are ultimately role model for kids, and then kids are getting the message that shouldn't talk about the dead. This isn't appropriate. We don't cry in front of other people. So kids are looking to adults for their direction and to find their way forward. And I think adults are unintentionally putting out a lot of mixed messages to kids because adults aren't sure either. So yes, kids across every age grieve. How that plays out looks different. And it looks different not based on age, actually, but based on the child, based on the child's needs, based on their developmental stages, based on their frame of references, based on the support systems that exist or don't exist in their lives. One of the things that commonly happens with kids is when adults try to protect them, they put out a lot of cliches and a lot of euphemisms for children. So all of a sudden, we went from mommy passed away. First of all, what does pass away mean? Because we're not like tumbleweed passing in front of a saloon here. So we don't use concrete language. And then quickly we switch to, she's with the angels in heaven. And one story that I've gotten so many miles out of, but is so relevant to this point, years ago when I was first starting, a dad called and he said, listen, my wife died yesterday. The kids were really upset, and now I can't get them to leave the house. We're going to go make funeral arrangements, but the kids won't leave. They're freaking out. What do I do? So I'm like, well, I have no idea what happened here. So I said to the dad, let's start over. Walk me through what happened from start to finish. So Mom dropped the kids off at school. On her way to work, she was T-boned at an intersection and killed. A couple hours later, a state trooper showed up at Dad's office, told him, and of course, worst nightmare ever comes true. He gets in his car. He calls the school. The kids are brought down to the lobby. He then gets on the phone, calls his parents and her parents, and the family starts to show up at their house. He gets to the school, and the school counselor and the principal and maybe their teacher or somebody else was with them. And, he knows that he has this message on his tongue that is going to change their life forever. And as he's saying it, he obviously breaks down and he's crying, and the kids see him, and so they start crying. And as he catches his breath, he says that Mommy's now in heaven with the angels. More tears. Everybody gets in the car. They get home. And now the kids see what looks like a party. People are showing up with food. They're getting a lot of attention. Their favorite people are there. Something bad happened, but it really didn't register. And then the next day, things start to click. And these kids don't want to leave the house because they're terrified that a flock of wild angels are going to come down, swoop them up, and take them away, and they're going to miss their next play date. Right? All of this chaos happened because somebody was distraught and didn't have the words to describe that Mom had died. Now, nobody's going to hold that against Dad. I mean, something horrible just happened to him, and something like that can be corrected pretty quickly. But those types of images and that sort of language is the norm across the whole sphere of people in a child's world. And that's the piece that we need to start changing. To acknowledge the desire to protect is natural and normal, but that we have to be informed and prepare kids and have normal conversations through the normalization of grief and death in our household and in our lives, because that'll equip them for the remainder of their lives.
Oh, so true. And in preparation for this interview, I had a talk with my husband, whose mother died when he was 12 years old, and just to ask him what that experience was like for him. And he said she had been sick with cancer for a long time, so he had already experienced losing her to a certain degree because she'd been in and out of the hospital, and things were not the same at home as they had been before. But he said after she died, no one ever talked to him about his feelings or what he was experiencing, including the teachers at his school. And he remembers so clearly the week before Mother's Day, the teacher handing out construction paper and saying, we're all going to make cards for our mothers today, and that he sat at his desk paralyzed, like, what do I do? What do I do? And yet, still, the teacher didn't recognize it or see his pain. And I wonder if you hear a lot of stories like this, that even in school, it's not being recognized, and children feel really alienated when they're in the classroom.
Yeah, there's so much of that. And again, this isn't the teacher's fault. Sometimes the death happened the year prior, and there's a breakdown in communication and processes of this information getting delegated up to the next year's teacher. So you have a kid who's hurting, and that information isn't isn't shared and accommodations aren't made as a result. Again, this is part of the preparedness. I think people don't know what to do with it, and so they don't talk about it, or their sensitivity is low. And then on the other side, sometimes the sensitivity is over heightened. So it's probably 4 or 5 years ago now. There were 3 triplet boys in high school, and one of the brothers died of a brain tumor over the summer. And I remember going in and speaking to the whole faculty, and the Spanish teacher decided to cancel the typical lesson plan on Day of the Dead. And the science teacher thought that it was necessary to cancel the dissection of the frogs because it was too death triggering. And the brothers were like, hold up. First of all, you knew my brother. You're not talking about him. You're not talking about our grief and acknowledging what just happened. And why are you changing these cool things? Like Day of the Dead is really awesome for Spanish class. And we're 13-year-old boys. Of course we want to dissect a frog. Mm-hmm. So communication breaks down. And the pesky thing about grieving kids is that they have a lot of needs, and those needs change on a daily basis, and we can't make assumptions about what those needs are. We have to check in with them. So rather than saying, I'm going to make an executive decision and remove the frog dissection, I'm going to say, hey, guys, we're going to dissect a frog in a couple of weeks, and that's going to be kind of cool and gruesome. Just wondering how you feel about it. Do you want to do it, or do you want to opt out? But it's their choice to make. And the problem is our culture as a whole is not huge into empowering kids and giving them choices. Now, a death happens, and all choice and control has been ripped away. I mean, the ultimate control has been ripped away, that our most precious people can be taken from us. So we can't have a helicopter approach to this. We need it to be holistic, and it needs to be rooted in communication and checking in with the kids, and not the type of support that as Americans we're most used to, which is, oops, something bad happened, let's mobilize the group, let's put a cooler on the front porch, drop off lasagna for 4 weeks, create a nice line outside the funeral home, and when all is said and done, hope we don't run into them at the grocery store, because that'll be awkward. We need to understand that grief is something that is a lifelong experience. And in those first couple of years, I mean, and for many people longer, it is really painful, and it is disruptive, and it is hard. And when we lose the people we love, we need other people to get us through that. But so often the other people don't show up. They fizzle off quickly. And now let's think about what that says to a child. And, you know, I work with kids where, let's say dad died. Dad's parents don't come around much anymore. Maybe there was a fight with mom. Maybe the kids are a painful reminder to their grandparents. So we're not just talking about an issue here that's entirely societal. It is also familial. And even our family makeup and how we function as a family, I think needs some consideration, because our expectations of each other, our expectations of when someone should go on dating, when we think somebody should be over it and functioning like they used to function, these are all falsities. And not only are they a disservice to all of us, they're particularly a disservice to the people who are grieving, including and especially children.
And I was wondering, should we really be readdressing the grief, like probably on an annual basis, at least with children, because they're growing and developing as they go, and it seems to me that their experience of grief is changing at each new stage of development as they go through that process.
Yeah, that's a perfect point, and you're spot on. And not to do a bit of a good grief promo piece here, but only to show how accurate you are. We recently launched a new initiative called Roots to Resilience, which is grief and resilience curriculum to be taught in classrooms. And it is teaching about grief in all of its manifestations, not just bereavement, and teaching about how to build resilience and promote a more empathic response from kids. And that, that includes the social emotional learning, etc., healthy coping strategies. And the reason why we did that is because we know that if little Timmy's mom dies today, he'll probably miss at least a week of school. Maybe not. He might want to go back to school tomorrow. But when he goes back to school, how his peer group responds to him is going to affect how he does and who he becomes as an adult. So if we can teach Timmy's children to be more empathic, to understand the impact of grief, well, Timmy's going to do better. And the part that is unfortunate here, Karen, and I'm sure your viewers, listeners will also be disappointed to hear this. This is a population that is bullied, terribly bullied. So many of our kids have really outrageous things said to them, like, if I were your mom, I would have killed myself too, or why don't you go die like your dad? And of course, that's ghastly. That is a horrible thing to say to another person. And oftentimes people think, wow, kids are such little monsters. What little twerps? Well, maybe, but really it's that they have no point of reference to understand how hard this is and what it's actually like to live without your mom or your little brother or your grandma, right? So it's not that the kids are monsters, but that we've given them nothing. We've given them no tools in order to actually be empathic and to be a good person to somebody in their peer group who's hurting. They don't necessarily know how unless they're getting some of those values from home.
Mm-hmm. And so we shouldn't just be waiting until there is a death in our family to talk to children about death and grief. We need to be teaching all children about it from a young age so that they have more empathy and have more awareness and in terms of what might be happening for their peers.
Yeah, it's like, I'm surprised they still even do this on airlines because I never take my earphones off now that we don't have to shut off our small devices. But, the stewardess, they get up, they still do the whole oxygen mask thing, right? And for those of us who travel frequently, it's in our head. But imagine that whole rigmarole about where your life vest is and to keep sucking on the mask even if it doesn't inflate. Imagine if they're teaching you that and showing you where the exits are when you're on your way down to the ocean. Like, kind of not going to retain any of that information. So why would we start addressing grief, 2 hours after a kid learns that their mom has a terminal diagnosis or their dad dropped dead of a heart attack? These are things that need to be taught very early on in age-appropriate ways. But at the end of the day, we're all going to die. Everybody we love is going to die. So why not start learning this and preparing for that? Because if we're empowered to do those things, I actually believe that we become more committed to our relationships. I believe we live richer and far more meaningful lives. I think one of the reasons why, or a contributor to the depression rate in the U.S. is that a lot of people don't necessarily live what they would characterize as meaningful, purpose-filled lives.
Mm-hmm.
Right, so there's obviously the chemical stuff, but I think that is a contributing factor. And one thing that sets a lot of us straight is our mortality, to know and to embrace that our time here is short and we really have absolutely no idea when it will be over. Well, we won't put up with a lot of the BS that I think a lot of us endure. That it is about more than a paycheck. It is about showing up for people when they need us. That should be a priority. And then when we do those things, people who are hurting get supported. So I think that that's a very important framework for a child to have early on. They're going to make very different choices if they understand this. I mean, it doesn't mean that they're not going to rebel, right? This talking about death and grief is not a fix-all to much of anything except for the maturation of healthy coping skills and ultimately the formation of resilience, right? Resilience is something that is built, and we need to give kids the tools to build that.
Mm-hmm. And I know, Joe, you mentioned already, like the goldfish. Don't flush the goldfish or replace it. Talk to the kids about death. But do you have any other tips for parents who want to teach their kids about death?
Yeah. Honesty, right? Being open and honest about it and sharing your feelings and your point of reference. So what was your first loss? Do you remember what you felt when that happened? Well, share that. Who was that person? How do you remember learning that news? I think sometimes parents, in an attempt to protect kids, will say things like, well, that'll never happen to me. I'm not going to die. And kids are smart, and they can sniff that out pretty quickly and say, well, other people do, so why are you immune to it? And I think what a lot of parents learn and sometimes become dismayed is when they realize that the kids care about you dying, but really they want to make sure the rest of their life is not going to be a mess and that they're going to be taken care of. And sometimes what they're really asking is, who's going to take care of me? How am I going to be okay? Because kids rely on adults for so many things that is very much at the heart of a kid's questioning. And also, I think talking about death is hard. How do you convey the sense of permanency to it and what it actually is? Well, at the end of the day, death is a biological event. It involves a bodily organ not functioning or multiple organs shutting down and not working together. The collaboration within the body has stopped. You think about little kids with their toys that have the round hole and the square hole, and just think about kids' toys. They're very mechanical. They understand that things need to work together. At that point, you're teaching kids about sharing and teamwork. Well, the body requires a lot of sharing and teamwork, and so talk about the biology of it. How do you know that something is living? Well, it breathes, it eats, you can talk on the telephone. Humor is also good with kids, so you can burp, you can fart, you can poop. And then how do you know something is dead? Well, you can't burp, you can't fart, you can't poop, you don't breathe, you can't talk on the telephone, you're cold. Those, very concrete. That's a really great place to start, by being open and honest, not giving them a lot, but following their lead, giving them the space to answer questions or to ask questions, and to know that they may go off for days or for weeks and just process it and then come back to you out of the blue with another random question, and that's okay.
And Joe, one thing that I've experienced working in hospice is that sometimes I observe that family members themselves are too overwhelmed with their own grief to actually talk to the children and deal with it. And I was wondering if you have suggestions for hospice workers of how might they be there for the children if it looks like the family just cannot manage that. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I think it's so important for the helpers to be prepared. And it's okay for us to acknowledge that whether you're a nurse or a social worker or a chaplain, pretty much none of us have been effectively trained in this subject matter. And, that's not on us, but getting the information is. And to know that people are overwhelmed and they don't know what to say, that they're new at this, well, we have a real privilege in the helping role of being able to coach and to fill in the gaps and to be of real great service to the children. You mentioned our Good Grief's website to your viewers, good-grief.org. There's a resource page. There are a bunch of free downloadable tip sheets, how to tell a child someone has died. There's a script there, effective communication within the family unit. There's a whole bunch of things up there that you can get. And truthfully, there's more and more appearing on the internet for people in helping roles to learn more and to become better equipped. And just to stay with this theme for a second, Karen, one of the things that I'm proud of that Good Grief has been doing in partnership with the Funeral Service Foundation is we created tools and resources. So this is going to be very relevant for your hospice audience. Tools and resources for families to include children in the funerals. Even in 2018, kids are getting excluded from the funerals of their loved ones because, again, people think, oh, that's too harmful to see, this is an adult activity, et cetera, et cetera. But funerals are human activities. It is our grief in motion. That is what mourning is, the outward expression of grief. It is a tool for us. It's really a medium in which we can do a lot of important processing and yet form community and get support. Like, what a beautiful thing to role model when well done. So in partnership with the Funeral Service Foundation, we produced a video, and that's on the funeralservicefoundation.org, I want to say, website, under the resources, and it's for Good Grief kids talking about what the funeral meant to them. And I think what's beautiful about it is you have a family who just lost somebody, and they're probably thinking, oh my God, are my kids going to be okay? And here come 4 cute, courageous, smart kids who say, I've been there. The funeral was part of me starting to build my resilience, and you can do this. And so what a gift those kids are giving out to the world. And that video went live from the foundation, I want to say, in the spring, and it already has over 1 million loads. We also created a toolkit that funeral homes will give to families. It's also a toolkit that hospices can hand out to families after a death. That's also going to be on the Funeral Service Foundation website to order those. And then an extra level is we wrote some tips for actual funeral directors to make sure that the profession itself is equipped for supporting kids and educating its parents. At the end of the day, what the research shows us about childhood bereavement is it is on all of us to do our part. A Good Grief and other programs like us, we can do some heavy lifting for kids, but what happens to them is going to be influenced by all of their environments where they live, learn, and play. So that's their school, that's at home, that's their sports team and their any church type of groups. It's on all of us to understand how do you interact with them and provide meaningful support and meet a child's unique individual needs. That starts on day one. That starts in the hospice. That starts when the doctor gives a diagnosis and is open and honest about the outcomes, rather than saying, "Hey, you're 40 years old, and we can throw the kitchen sink at you to see if you can survive this." To talk about the fact that you might not, and what are your plans to live a meaningful life with your kids for whatever time you may or may not have. What is the quality of life you want to have in your family? It affects all of us, and all of us have a part to play in it. And I think it ultimately, it's a privilege for us to step up and to do our part. That it really has long-term ramifications for individuals, but for all of us collectively.
You're so right. And I want to thank you for sharing those resources. The Youth and Funerals video I watched, and it's excellent. It's
Oh, did you?
so well done and so reassuring. And it reminded me when my children were 4 and 6, their 5-year-old cousin died of a congenital condition. And we decided to take our children to the funeral because it was a funeral for a child. So, it was
Yeah,
like
yeah.
child-centric. And plus, I was working in hospice, and they'd already heard a lot of conversations about death. And a beautiful thing, one of the adults who spoke at the funeral mentioned that their cousin Eric loved rainbows and was kind of obsessed with them and always drawing rainbows and things. And so the very next day after that funeral, we had a rainstorm and there was a rainbow. And my kids,
Oh, wow.
this is what they took away from the funeral. My kids said, "Oh, look, Eric is saying hello to us." And for years after that, every time we saw a rainbow, the kids would say, "Hello, Eric, how are you?" And so, when I think of when we imagine kids at a funeral, we have all these fears in our minds of how traumatic it could be, but it was actually beautiful. My kids, they remembered the rainbow. That's what they took away from that service, and it became a source of comfort for them, but also a way of still feeling connected to their cousin. So anyway, I just wanted to validate that. I'm a huge supporter of the idea of including children in funerals whenever we can.
Yeah, and that's such a beautiful example, Karen. Research language would call that continuing bonds, that what kids really, really need. And before I say this, let's think about what we actually do as a culture. But what kids really need is to maintain an ongoing sense of connection and relationship with the person who died. And I would go further to say that's what we all need. And so, it's interesting, too, when you look cross-culturally. So cultures that have, I guess, what they would call ancestor altars, right? Just to remember where you came from. And you're a part of the human tribe. And to maintain that sense of connection is so important. And yet, the pain of grief, the lack of language to talk about it, leads us so often to silence. Not sure how to bring them up, when to bring them up. Is talking about them going to be too painful? And so nothing is said. And that doesn't do much for something that's so important as maintaining this sense of connection and to know that your loved one mattered. I think that's another big piece of it.
Yes, that definitely resonates with me because I remember after my dad died, how much comfort I took in how many people came to the funeral. And it was that same feeling of knowing like all of these people cared about my dad and they're all here sharing this grief too. We're all part of this together. And it was very comforting to see that there were hundreds of people. It wasn't just my immediate family that was experiencing the loss, but all kinds of people throughout our community.
Yeah, there's real power in that sense of community and gathering, right?
Oh, yes, absolutely. And I really like what you're saying. I think that you're right that our entire society will change gradually over time if we pay attention to how we deal with grief with children. If we at least are cognizant and make an effort to try to introduce children to death as time goes on, that's going to have a huge impact even on the medical system and how we offer care at the end of life, just because we're increasing consciousness about death.
Oh, absolutely. Right. The ramifications here are huge. And we look at the unbelievable growing costs of end-of-life care. I think so much of that is systemic of just a broken culture that this is a real hard thing for us and we need to take it on. And I would love for the baby boomers to take it on in one way. I mean, in some ways they are, but I think that's just in some ways it's the personalized funeral, right? It's no offense to anybody out there who this is important to, but for me, it's the silly stuff. It's the personalized casket and the frou-frou. It's not necessarily the stuff of substance. And I think our culture needs some leadership, and it needs leadership from our elders who are in fact facing their own mortality. Give us the language, give us the tools to talk about this, role model it for us, show us what a good death looks like. And instead, I think what we're getting a lot of is, I'll show you what a fight looks like, and I will give it my all to stay alive for as long as possible, rather than the good death. And that, and of course, I think I know I'm probably preaching to the choir here, that's comfortable language for you and me and for your listeners, I'm sure. But how do we help the public understand? Because it affects the kids, but it affects all of us. How do we help them be introspective and to really think about what quality life means, and to acknowledge that that's scary, because some people might come up from that question and realize that their tank is a little empty, and that perhaps that hasn't been obtainable to this point. And so how can they consider a course correction? And again, how can they share that with the rest of us so that we can learn and we can continue to grow and evolve in this incredible part of the human experience?
And I like it when you suggested baby boomers stepping up in a way as the elders in our society. And I just had this image in my mind of how awesome it would be if baby boomers committed to help teach their grandchildren about aging and about death by having conversations with their grandchildren as they get older and proceed through the years, and even preparing their grandchildren that someday I won't be here, but I'm here now, so we're going to enjoy our time together while I'm here. And I agree with you. We need that kind of leadership to come from the elders who hopefully have been gaining wisdom throughout this lifetime, who can pass that on.
That's the hope.
Hopefully. Well, let's see. I wanted to point people again to the Good Grief website, good-grief.org, because you do, as you said, you have some downloadable tip sheets there. Your TED Talk is there. I saw the Youth and Funerals video on your website also.
Yep, that's there too. Yep.
And let's see, is there anything else somewhere? Maybe this was the National Alliance for Grieving Children. I saw, is it like a workbook or a coloring book or something that adults and children can do together around grief?
Yeah, Good Grief has one. It's a companion guide to my book, What Do We Tell the Children? And then the other resource we have, too, that you can get on Amazon is called The Invisible Tattoo. And that we produced after my book came out. We self-published The Invisible Tattoo, and it's an anthology of stories and testimonials from our families. And then we also have some stuff from our volunteers, and to show how people doing this work are inspired. So we do have those resources, which are also on our website. And the National Alliance for Grieving Children does have a really excellent activity book for children and adults to do together. So Good Griefs is a bit of it's a companion piece with my book, but also an activity book. The National Alliance for Grieving Children is a full-on activity book. And I think these are just great tools, especially for communities that don't have access to a children's bereavement center. Also interesting for the charge that you and I just came up with to our baby boomers. These are activity books that I think grandparents could do with their grandkids, and are vehicles for those types of challenging conversations. And that actually reminds me too, if people are going to go to the Funeral Service Foundation, they had a very interesting initiative tied to this conversation. It's called the Talk of the Lifetime, and it's a card deck and it just asks questions. And it asks questions about to reflect on people's lives. Like, hey, what was your first pet? And what's a crazy memory associated with that pet? And I think even as a culture, we're not only dealing with a lack of transference of knowledge for end of life issues. I think, and I know this isn't universally true, but for many people, oral history and sort of that art of talking about your ancestors and your childhood, as Americans, we talk about the greatest generation and that post World War One, right? Is it World War One or is it World War Two? Help me out.
World War II. Yeah.
It is too. I think that when I try to invoke memories of who were really great storytellers, it's usually the vets, right? That they were known for telling stories. I don't know if that's really still something that's happening on a regular basis. I was raised in a Sicilian Irish household. My Sicilian folks, they probably taught me the most about death too, because even when I was 5 years old, we would say goodbye after the end of a visit and, love you, see you next time. And my grandmother would say, well, if I'm still here. And, this sense of mortality was always looming in that morbid Sicilian mindset. But oral history is important, and I think that's what the Talk of the Lifetime is doing. It's the transference of memory and connection. That's ultimately how we maintain a relationship with people after they die, and we should care about that, Karen, because if we're not doing that for ourselves, well, guess what? We're going to be forgotten when we're dead and gone too. So there is something self-serving about this, that you only have a legacy if people hang around enough to actually like you and to tell your story when you're gone.
So true. And I have a deck of those cards, the Talk of a Lifetime cards. Yeah, they're excellent. So I would highly recommend that people get those from funerals. Let's see, Funeral Service Foundation. Is that?
Yep. .org. Yeah. I'm pretty sure. Yep.
Yeah, I highly recommend those. In these days of everyone having a smartphone and being on social media all the time and then streaming things on Netflix, we're all engaged in technology somehow, and we're missing all the storytelling that used to take place just sitting around the table. And so these cards are a good way to just remind us, just ask some questions and get the conversation going.
I'm thinking you and I, we're so old school. We're totally vintage here. And maybe what we need to do is take our dog and pony show to the hipsters. We'll go to Brooklyn, because that's how we're going to get the next generation. We're going to be vintage.
That's true. That's true. All right. I accept that challenge.
I love it.
We'll do that. Well, Joe, I want to thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule, because I know you're actually at a camp right now, right, for a camp for grieving children. And so I'm sure you're extremely busy there.
Yeah, we're having a good time. All of our bunch of Good Grief kids are here camping. Hopefully it wasn't too loud in the background. They're doing art, theater, and all sorts of other joy-filled things. And Karen, it's such a pleasure and joy to be with you. Thanks so much for having this conversation.
Well, you're so welcome. I'm just so thrilled to be able to present it to the audience, because I think it's so important. And I'll remind everyone that I'm talking to Joe Primo, who's the CEO of Good Grief, and you can go to good-grief.org and learn a lot more and find out about the resources there. So, Joe, thanks again, and go back and enjoy your art and theater with the kids.
Wonderful. Thanks a ton, Karen. Take good care.
All right, you too. Goodbye.
I hope you enjoyed that interview with Joe Primo. As I said, that was one of my very favorite interviews that I did a year ago. And so I'm honored and excited to bring it back to you again to make sure you can learn from the wisdom Joe has to offer, and also find out more about Good Grief and also the National Alliance for Grieving Children. So I loved his tips for adults talking to children about grief. One, being honest and how important that is. And he also mentioned not using euphemisms that might cause confusion in children about what has really happened, like the angels took your mother away. And also being very open about your own feelings and letting children know if you feel sad and if you feel upset, because they will certainly detect that and read it in your emotions. And it's important that you talk openly about what's really happening for you. Also, let them know that they will be okay, that you're creating a safe space for them, that they're not alone, they're not dealing with this by themselves, and they will be okay, and you're going to help them be okay. Another was creating a safe space for them to ask questions. So make sure that they know it's all right to bring it up, even though it's painful for all of us. It's all right to ask whatever you need to know. And he also mentioned treating death as a biological event. And I think that's really important when we're teaching kids about death is utilize nature, because there are so many signs around us of death that are constantly there. And when we're taking a walk out in the woods, we might see a dead bird on the ground, or we might see a dead fish that washed up on the beach. And I think we can utilize even a dying tree, or looking at the dead leaves that fall off the tree in autumn. So use nature as a way of talking to kids about death and teaching them about that from an early age. I loved the fact that Joe shared so many resources, and I wanted to let you know there's an excellent handout on the Good Grief website that talks about grief at various developmental stages for children. And so Joe and I talked a little bit about that how you deal with death and grief may differ depending on the age or the developmental stage of the child, and also that you may want to revisit grief periodically over time as the child grows and their ability to reason and think rationally grows. Then you may want to revisit conversations and keep returning to the grief, and also returning to conversations about death as they become able to comprehend it differently. And so, again, on the Good Grief website, on the resources tab, there are, I think, about 20 different handouts that you can download and print. All sorts of things talking about grief with children, talking about death with children, offering your support. But there are so many things that you can find on that website. So whether you are a parent and you want to be prepared for how to talk to your child about grief, or a grandparent and you want to take up the cause that Joe and I mentioned of maybe being a baby boomer who decides, I'm going to teach my grandchildren what it's like to grow older and age. I'm going to talk about that openly and honestly with them, and even be part of preparing them for what is ahead in the future. So go to Good Grief, it's good-grief.org, and look up all the resources that are available there. We also mentioned Joe's book, What Do We Tell the Children? There is an adult and child activity book that we mentioned that's on the National Alliance for Grieving Children website. Again, these are links that are all available on the show notes for this episode. So you can just simply go to eolupodcast.com and look for episode number 224. Scroll down and you'll find links for every single thing we talked about, the books we mentioned, the workbook or activity book for adults and children to do together. There's a video on youth and funerals. So all sorts of things that can be helpful for us as we're dealing with grief. And I think every death doula, every hospice worker, every parent, every grandparent should have resources and tools available so that you know if you need to deal with death with your children, which you should plan on it and be prepared for it. You have the tools available to you that you need. So check it out. I am excited that I could help make this available to you. I wanted to mention also the book, The Invisible Tattoo. has stories of children and how they've dealt with loss and grieving. And so that's something that could be an interesting gift for Christmas to use to read some stories to children if you know someone who's going through grief. That and also that activity book. So consider those as things that you might give to a family with children that's dealing with loss and grief at the holiday season. I just wanted to mention that. I think these are fantastic resources. So, thank you for joining me today. Remember, next week there will be another new episode of the podcast. As always, it's my honor and pleasure to share information like this with you, and I really appreciate you for being my audience and listening in and joining me on this journey of learning about the end of life. If you do enjoy this content, please share these episodes with other people so that they can benefit from them as well. And consider leaving a review on iTunes or Spotify or Stitcher Radio or iHeartRadio, wherever you happen to be listening in to the podcast. Really appreciate all of you out there. I feel your love and support, and I hope you feel mine, because I'm sending it out to you every time I record in every episode. My most heartfelt wishes for you, especially as we approach the holidays here, that your lives are filled with love. So until next week, remember, we're here for love. So face your fear, be ready for whatever happens next in this crazy lifetime of ours, and love each and every moment of this life. Bye-bye.